Hey everyone, my name is Huelsman. I am the Managing Director at Advocacy Rising, and I am incredibly honored to host and moderate this next panel around policy. Before I introduce and bring our folks up, I want to situate us a little bit in terms of how do we end up in this moment around policy, and where is the next step going to take us. So rewind 5 years, and when we said public policy supporting local news, there was a whole lot of folks saying, I don't know about that. But some optimism and energy to say, what should we be thinking about? The Carter Media Project really took this question on to ask, can we and should we do public policy, right, as a broader local ecosystem? And with that, they commissioned a white paper report to bring out what does the universe of potential policy options look like. If folks were to engage in this, what policies are in front of us? How do we make sure that that work is First Amendment friendly and really directs what we can understand as that broader group? Carter Press Association, shout out to Tim, has really taken a lot of this work and put it into action over the last 5 years. Carter Press Association introduced HB 1121 in the 2021 legislative session, which would have given tax credits to local businesses that were advertising in local papers. And then the past 2 sessions, they were really working on a community news corps fellowship concept. Unfortunately, neither one of those policies moved forward, but what we got was an incredible amount of momentum and also socializing some deeper comfortability with doing policy proactively to support the local news ecosystem in Colorado. CMP brought Advocacy Rising on earlier this year and really asked the question, okay, we've been in this for 5 years. What would it look like going out 5 years? What do we need to really think about building transformational public policy and bringing together a broader, more diverse coalition? And in conversations with many of you here, with national leaders, with folks at the community level, we had a couple of things that really stood out. First, we need a broader table of folks at the Capitol working together in coalition to move towards transformational public policy. Carter Press Association, Tim out there doing a heroic job, cannot be the only one there in coalition. How do we bring together this group of people and a diverse set of stakeholders whose issue area isn't necessarily media, but directly touches the work that we all do? Second, there is quite honestly a deep protectionist fear in the Capitol around supporting local news. That is, why would we support journalists losing jobs in a declining industry? We don't do that in other places. And the work that we have in front of us is to fundamentally shift that conversation to this is not about supporting an industry, this is about supporting people on the ground. That local news is a fundamental institution to our democracy, to our economy, to our local communities. And that supporting local news is supporting the diversity of people in the state, right? Of Democrats and Republicans, of rural and urban, that bringing that diverse group of people together and centering their voices is so essential to where we need to go. So that this isn't a conversation about industry, this is a conversation about the most fundamental institution that we have to protect. And from that, we are sort of now at a precipice of saying, okay, what is the next big step that we take? How do we bring this diverse group of people together in alignment to recognize our full power and to move in lockstep, representing that narrative of more diverse voices? And so through Colorado Media Project, we're going to start that work of bringing a coalition together focused on one fundamental issue, and that is public funding for local news ecosystem in the state of Colorado. There's so many issue areas that different associations and groups in this room focus on, and we need a space to say, how do we address the revenue issue? How do we address getting public funding to dramatically and transformationally support local news? So what I'm going to do is bring up our panelists to really engage in this conversation of where we are now today and thinking through what do different policy options look like? What are different approaches around coalition building? How can we think about this as long-term work? And one thing that I want everybody to sit with is really understanding this fundamental thing about organizing, that we tend to overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can accomplish in a decade. As we're bringing these folks up, think in the perspective of decade. Where can we be in 2035, 2045? What is possible? Really sitting in that space of imagining what's possible. So with that, I will invite our panelist guests up. We have Anna Brugmann from Rebuild Local News, who is the policy director. We have Christina Shih, who is associate director at Press Forward. Brittany Winkfield, who's a board member at Carlisle Press Association. Amanda Mountain, who's president and CEO of Rocky Mountain Public Media. And Teresa Gorman from Democracy Fund. So give her a round of applause. So within this room, we have folks from philanthropy, from policy, and local media leaders from our state. Christina, I'm going to kick it off with you, and we'd love to hear more about Press Forward's work nationally to align philanthropic dollars and how public policy plays a role in that work.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me and for having me join this wonderful panel. So you all may be familiar with Press Forward as this donor collaborative that has brought together over 60 funders to commit $500 million to local news over the next 5 years. But I kind of want to take a step back and explain this other element that we've really seen gain momentum since we announced last September. Press Forward is really becoming a national movement and a national conversation to get everybody, especially funders, individuals, businesses, and in this case, the government, to see what is their role in rebuilding a local news ecosystem. So where we are right now is bringing together groups of funders to understand and imagine the possibilities of what do we want the future of local news to look like, and what is media policy's role in that. So we are just getting started and having conversations about what does policy look like, what does inclusive implementation look like, and happy to share more later on.
And thank you. And Teresa, I've heard you talk in the past about this idea of philanthropy extending the runway, right? So we have an amazing initiative nationally with Press Forward. We have Colorado Media Project and Press Forward in Colorado engaged in this work. Philanthropy is extending the runway. And how do we think about this long term? Where are we going, and what are some potential solutions?
Yes, I think that the reality is there's not enough money from philanthropy for the structural change we're trying to see. I think 500 million is an amazing number, but there's so much cost modeling that we're doing. We'll hear some today for Colorado. A recent cost model was done by the Racial Equity in Journalism Fund that asked the question, how can we build a thriving local news ecosystem that's truly served and led by BIPOC communities? And anyone want to guess what that number was? $71 billion yearly we would need. It's much bigger than many other cost models, but why I like that number is because of that vision and that decade-long perspective that we want to bring into this, because this is about structural systems change. If we want to be successful, that's the vision that we have to look for. And I was really excited today to hear all the pieces and comments and conversations about building community engagement, listening to community, because the true long-term solution, once we get some of this policy change, is having people and communities that advocate for local news, that need it so desperately that they will stand up for it. They will pay for it, but they will also advocate for public policy solutions to kind of get to that amazing $71 billion number.
Thank you. I am embodying from now on the idea we were talking about filling us with a beat. No, I'm not going to say that. Anna, I want to pass it to you. So a lot of folks in this room are saying, great, we're excited, we hear you, policy. What's actually on the table? What are other states doing to advance policy forward? And specifically, if you were thinking about some of the big exciting ideas around funding in particular, what's out there, what can we look at as models?
Yeah, and so obviously I can't like just on policy because I feel like you your favorite child. But I think it's starting by what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the most emergent problems in our industry? And I think most of us in this room know that if we're not talking about money, we're not talking about the problem. So the solutions have to result in general operating dollars for newsrooms. And so with that in mind, you can kind of think of like the hierarchy of needs, the food, water, shelter, general operating money. What are the public policies that are being pursued that get more of those general operating dollars into newsrooms opening? And so there's two policies that I'm really excited about. One was passed both Illinois and New York. It's an employment subsidy, so it's a tax credit. It's a refundable tax credit for the number of journalists you have on staff and what they're paid, and that creates the right incentive structure. And done correctly, it also gets enough general operating dollars into newsrooms that you can solve non-editorial problems as well. In New York, this program was structured at a refundable tax credit up to 50% of a journalist's salary, up to $50K, so that equals potentially $25K for journalists, up to $250K for a newsroom, and up to $400K for a chain. So if you can think of $250K in a newsroom, that's enough to solve some editorial problems, some non-editorial problems. Get a new CNS, upgrade technology, hire a reporter. We just heard about the transformative power of beat reporting. Invest in beats. And that can have a snowball effect. So because we're paying the subsidy to jobs, you increase your jobs, you increase the benefits. And there's lots of ways that you can tweak this to account for costs or incentivize new hires. But we're really excited about that framework. And if I could pick one policy to just like pass at every state or federal level tomorrow, that would be it at this stage. Because I think it addresses the problem. We need more journalists in our communities. We need more general operating dollars in our newsrooms. Those are not going to always be the problems we're trying to solve, but those are the most immediate problems that we hear from newsrooms. There's another policy I'm really excited about. It's actually been introduced in Colorado a couple sessions ago, and I saw somebody from Lower Foundation today, Casey, and they did a pilot house along these lines, but it's a small business advertising incentive. And of course, we know that advertising is not the bedrock foundation on which journalism is built anymore, but it's still, in many cases, a really important cornerstone. And when one of those cornerstones of the house starts to wobble, it's very difficult to account for it in other forms of revenue. And so with these small investment and small business advertising incentives, saying through a tax credit or a grant, we are incentivizing you to go advertise in local media, you can reinforce that relationship between small businesses who may have never advertised in local news or used to advertise in local news before something happened in 2020, and they haven't come back. And reinforce that relationship that a community news outlet has with their community businesses. And when we first started discussing this back in 2021, I think at the federal levels, we were really thinking of it in terms of how to support commercial news outlets. But actually in the last few years, public radio has begun to double down on its local sponsorship strategy. Nonprofit newsrooms, there's nonprofit newsrooms launched today I talked to, but their sustainability plan includes 25% local sponsorships. And so these types of policies can really support a broad swath of the ecosystem while supporting another important part of any community, which is the small business community. So we're keeping a very close eye on those, and not just those.
Awesome, love it, thank you. Amanda, as someone who is a leader in the public media space, I think we have like a really powerful historical example around the Public Broadcasting Act and what it took to get towards transformational federal policy. What are some of the lessons learned from that work, and what's possible now in terms of a broad-based organizing model at the state?
Yeah, I mean, just to draw some context to what's been said already about how much money we really need to make a systemic change in our business, the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 makes it possible for this last year, $525 million to come into thousands of public media organizations across all 50 states. And there are lessons, I think, that could be carried forward from how that initial funding mechanism was established that could be relevant for us to consider today. There are about 5 things when I look at that process. that stand out to me. It originally was rooted in philanthropy. The Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Commission for Educational Television built a grassroots coalition of community members that really reflected public will. And that was the first thing that had to happen before anything else. Then foundations applied their political power to the Democratic Party platform at the time under Lyndon Johnson to get this as a priority. It was not a priority. They were not going to plan to look at this at all. And it was the kind of the collective will that the foundations both brought to the table with these high net worth individuals, but also the public coalition that they had built. Then they built off of established legislation. They did not start from scratch, which was really critical. They reopened the Communications Act of 1934 and amended that. They added public radio. They did a few other things that we now know as the infrastructure of public media funding today. But that went a long way in helping them get this ultimately through. Then they identified representatives of key community coalitions that were also really great storytellers. This is where you see Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, testify because originally the Public Broadcasting Act was popular in the Senate and funded and like it sailed through, but not in the House. It was really these storytellers representing different factions of the coalition that got it over the line. And then finally, the language that was drafted when they reopened and amended that 1934 Act was broad, but it was clear. It had a focus that represented the public needs and the good from their perspective. There was no inside baseball, which was really critical. So those are the things that jumped out to me when I look at how that original funding was really approached.
Amazing, love it. And I think for all of us sitting in this room of saying, we're sort of sitting with this feeling of, oh yes, this must have been inevitable that we ended up with public funding, $500 million a year to support public media. But these are deep grassroots campaigns over many, many years to get us there. So when we're situating ourselves at the state level, what is possible within the Colorado state legislature, really thinking about ourselves as engaged actors as a part of that story and moving something ambitious forward. Brittany, I want to pass it over to you as someone who's been in private media for much of your career and as a board member of Colorado Press Association, which represents small rural papers, ethnic media outlets, large statewide papers. What do you think it's going to take to have local media thrive in the state, and what role could policy play in that?
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to start by saying my journey in journalism began, we're talking 20 years ago, in 2004, in the Aurora Sentinel newsroom as an intern. Shout out to Dave Perry, he's here somewhere. But this is before the digital boom and just where we are today. And I've worked in a variety of publications, 5280 magazine here in Colorado, Vibe magazine in New York, Upscale magazine in Atlanta, kind of just done it all, Denver Urban Spectrum, and currently with the Colorado Ethnic Media Exchange, which is a coalition of publications. I do want to have my leaders of that group just stand, please, if you don't mind, doing the work. Thank you, Annie, Hector, Casey, Vera, and Dave. Just an incredible initiative that we've started because, as mentioned today, advertising was the bread and butter of the industry. And so we're just thinking creatively on how we build out sponsorships and just a real sustainable, built in or kind of baked in, I like how Frank Mungeon put it last year, this baked in foundation of funding. I think through my experience, I've noticed this gap in funding, and unfortunately, like in this industry that I love so much and I have such a passion for, it is hard to thrive and really, see the future when, we can't make payroll or, things just at the basic level. And so what really intrigued me was just seeing this example out of New York City where they passed a law, and you may have heard me speak on this, but seeing the possibility in how they required the government, and I think this was at the city level, to spend half of its advertising budget on local media, and in particular ethnic media or community media, with the mission focus. And I think that really does start cracking at, having this baked in recipe, if you will. And I do know that, this industry is tough, and no matter if it's mainstream or not, I think we do have to start thinking bigger in terms of, are we selling just a quarter page ad this month, or are we talking to not only foundations, but I'm thinking these corporations on a level of, how are we working with government to make sure that this industry is not really losing its track, because I just see like this clear picture, but it will take all of us to build this ecosystem. I'm like, if we don't learn anything else today, it's like we need each other, and it's not just one entity that can do it alone.
Yes, we love that. So thinking a little bit more expansively, often when we come into these conversations about policy, it's sort of like pass the bill, that's it, end of story. And there's so much more work, and in particular, Brittany, what you're sort of pointing out here is that we need all of us at the table. One of the questions that we have for folks on the philanthropy side is, in particular, when we're thinking about infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure and implementation, how can we prioritize that work to make sure that we are building robust and sustainable and durable movements?
So at Press Forward, we have 4 strategic pillars. There's sustainability, there's equity, there's infrastructure, and there's policy. But the truth is, it's all intersectional and it's all related. So when we're talking about, this, we're looking at maybe 10, 20 years horizon, and we're looking at the urgent basic needs that users need now to survive. One of the things that we are really wrestling with is this tension of how do we move philanthropy to solve the most urgent needs and build up the capacity of the sector, so when we do see really transformational public funding, the sector is ready to absorb all of that. And so when we think about sustainability, this is about revenue streams, different business models. How do we identify and uplift newsrooms that are experimenting and being close to communities? When we talk about equity, this isn't just equity in terms of journalism coverage, but closing gaps in talent and pipeline development. Where I live in California, there is a program where UC Berkeley gets public funding to place fellows in different newsrooms. This is all part of that work. And when we think about infrastructure, the digital CMS, this is probably something many of you have gone through, maybe don't want to go through again, but this is a true cost that really enables you to make money, to connect with audiences, and to be able to get your reporting out there in the community more effectively. So these are a lot of the things that we're talking about at an urgent level, and also thinking about what is the balance between what we can do now before we're able to also move on a parallel track with policy, which philanthropy moves slow, but making policy move slower, and it's not fast enough for journalism. But we're all trying to, sit in the middle and see how we can help connect the dots and move in that direction together.
Maybe I'll add an example or two. So at Democracy Fund, we funded a lot of work in New Jersey that eventually led to the creation of the New Jersey Civic Info Consortium. But it was about a decade of work. And so philanthropy has to be patient, has to invest that work into that infrastructure. And a lot of that work was community engagement, was building up the hubs and the backbone so that they would be ready when the law was passed. And then when the policy was passed to create this organization that got public funding, they had to then decide, how are we going to distribute it? Is it equitable? Because we often find with public policy in the past that things get passed and it's not equitably distributed and people are left out, and we're just perpetuating the harms that we've created in the past. So we really need to invest in these types of organizations and people that will understand kind of what to do. And those folks who are doing that in New Jersey actually have to go to lawmakers every year to re-get their budget. So it's constant for them. And then another example is the New York example, which I love. The Center for Community Media in New York, once that law was passed, decided who's going to help all of this, the ethnic media and community media apply to get the money and get the advertising? And so they had to create training, they had to make sure it was distributed. So that's really a really important place for philanthropy, to make sure we're investing in that wraparound services and that implementation is actually happening.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Just building on this theme, the original Public Broadcasting Act was also broken into 3 parts, and they have parallels to some tools we already have in Colorado that gives us a leg up over other states. The first part was really around upgrading and strengthening the existing ecosystem, essentially, figuring out how much do we need, how much money do we need, how could that money be distributed in equitable ways. And we do have the beginning of this study about what do we need. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. The second part was establishing kind of an infrastructure organization. In public media's case, it was the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And that entity really created figured out, like they created a granting entity that figured out how these funds were going to be distributed ongoing and what were the rules that were going to govern that in line with the legislation. In that case, fortunately we have Kyle, who's employed by CMP, who can actually help us think about what does that infrastructure look like as we're building out a concept for what the legislation could be. And then part 3 is funding a study done by in this case, it was the Secretary, or the Secretary of Wealth, Education, and Welfare, that determined how is educational broadcasting further improving the lives of citizens. But in our case, in Colorado, we have lots of studies that have been done that we can continue to refine and improve upon to give us a sense of what do people need. But you've heard examples all morning of organizations that are tapping into that conversation in their communities already. How can we keep building on those themes? So we actually do have some roadblocks. We have roadblocks, but we also have building blocks that we can build on together and grow and expand to get to where Kyle described us being in 10 years or less, right?
Thank you. So many of you in this room are sitting here saying, wow, this sounds so great. And also, I'm so nervous about the First Amendment, government influence, government interference, which are all deeply and important questions that we want to take seriously, right? And in that, we want to pass it to Anna for maybe a 2-minute response, and then we're going to have a closing. Right after this, how can we think about really guaranteeing protection from government interference while at the same time pursuing government support?
I think you said earlier that it would be easy to think that public broadcasting was inevitable, that it was always going to be that way. Policy is never inevitable. It's all about choices. And the choices we make about journalism policy are incredibly important. It's all in the definitions. A lot of us are journalists in this room. We know that democracy is boring, and it should be. And in this case, the important parts of these bills are the definitions. How are we defining local journalism? Is it content neutral? Who are we empowering to make decisions? Are those decisions subjective? How close is the power that we're placing in any institution to the person, the government official who might misuse it? All of those are really important thoughts that we go through every time we craft a public policy. And we at Rebuild Local News take that incredibly seriously because we're all former journalists and our nightmare would be to create a public policy that undermines independent journalism. But I also think it's important to remember, I think what we've all articulated in different ways, that we've always done this. This has always been a part of the United States that we've always made. We as a country, usually a federal government early on, have always made decisions that we were going to support a free and independent press. When the United States was founded, it took a different track than every other one of its comparable countries at the time, and it didn't tax advertising. It created infrastructure to spread journalism across a very disparate territory. And it subsidized the production of that news. That was a choice that no other country made that we did, and it's reflected in the diversity of our local press today. And so many of those policies still exist. Postal subsidies, discounts for print, all of those things. But obviously technology has changed, our industry has changed. We need to make some new and creative and really intentional choices to create a local press that brings us into this new era of local journalism.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. I'm going to pass it to Brittany for this. So thinking about really being at the ground level as someone that is in the work day by day, what does a thriving local ecosystem look like for you? And when we're thinking about that 10-year picture, that 20-year picture, where could we be going?
Thank you, Kyle. I think I was thinking in terms of, knowing that in 10 years we will still be here. I think that is the definition of thriving, like not having to worry about tomorrow and just really planning for that, being able to be creative and strategic about, how might we look in 10 years, but not having, unfortunately, the finances be the limited resource that it's prohibiting that, creativity and thriving mindset, I'll say, to journalists and newsroom owners, founders, for them to be able to retire and just, see that this business is going to last another 10, 20 plus years.
Amazing, love it. Give a round of applause to our amazing panel. And I want to ask of all of you, so we've heard from Amanda, we've heard from other folks that it takes all of us, and you all genuinely are the ecosystem that we need to be a part of this work. Engaging in policy for some folks is going to look very, very different than other organizations. And we want all of you at the table. One shout out at the end of this, there's going to be a call to action. If you want to learn more about joining the Policy Coalition, we want you, we need you. It's a fairly low time commitment. And this genuinely, we have to have the full power of this room together to be able to think about transformational policy. So this is your invitation to come join us and deeply, deeply appreciate all of your support. Thank you.